So everybody's a writer, right? I mean, like on our face, we know that's not true, but everybody learns how to write in school. So when it comes time to make your big creative project, like let's say you want to make the Amazing Digital Circus, or some other kind of indie project, you know how to write. I mean, you can write, you learned. Or did you? Now, before we get into that, there's actually a lot to unpack with this idea of being independent. For starters, pretty much none of us now are independent. You can't be. I mean, we all have to go through the same distributor, the same advertiser, like it's all vertically integrated. Everything is controlled by Google. Independence is a myth, and it's probably going to continue to be a myth for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, maybe the rest of our lives. There's some hinting of some shakeups, like there were some antitrust lawsuits, but I feel like realistically we're gonna have to deal with this forever. And it's important that you just make peace with that. Because when you look at something like the Amazing Digital Circus and you say like, oh, I want that level of success, the first thing you have to examine is the environment that it was successful in. Now, the Amazing Digital Circus has some great animation fundamentals, and if you're interested in becoming an animator, I would totally take them as inspiration for that career. It looks good, like it looks good in motion, the characters are very expressive. It's a good show on that front. But I don't think that that's why it's got hundreds of millions of views right now. I don't think that's really the key behind its success. There is no independence. Some managers at YouTube have this perspective of what is a good video and what should get promoted, and the Amazing Digital Circus falls into it. It happens to have that sort of lore bait. It's brightly colored and attracts kids. It's got that kind of Five Nights at Freddy's feel. Can you actually replicate this without just making virtually a clone of the Amazing Digital Circus? I mean, Gooseworks also had a large seed audience. It seems unlikely that you could copy their formula. In fact, I'll tell you, generally speaking, you can't do what they did and then get successful on it. Because a lot of indie projects do what they do and fail because of what they do. The writing is not very good. So you can write, yeah, like you've learned. I like to write creatively as a hobby, but when I first started doing stuff for like YouTube and whatever, I didn't know when or how to say I was a good writer. Like, people liked what I wrote, but I couldn't have put my finger on it to say why to start with. But then gradually, as I started to work into different mediums, for example, my friend Pencils invited me to write a comic together with him, I realized I was really bad at writing comics. And that's when I started to realize that there are fields of writing. And you could be a good writer of character dialogue or a good writer of exposition, but you might not be a good comic book writer because that's a different field. So if you take animation as an analog, you could be a special effects animator or like a character animator or so on and so forth. There's different fields in animation. You don't necessarily have one person who's good at every type of animation because there's too many different types of animation that need to be done. Just because you're good at animating soup does not mean that you're going to be good at fight choreography. Likewise, just because you're talented at writing character dialogue doesn't mean you can necessarily turn around and write a romantic comedy unless you plan to have it rely heavily on dialogue. So what we see with indie projects is that it's very typical for an animator to not be an amazing writer, but they can write exposition, and the reason why they can write exposition is because that's what they learned to do in school. See, school teaches you how to write term papers. You sit down, you explain what something is to somebody. That's exposition. That's expository writing. That is like the main thing they teach you in school. So if you were able to pass high school English, you learned to write basic exposition. That's what they taught you. You spent your entire young life learning how to write like that. So what kind of story does every independent animator write when they decide they're going to sit down and make their first cartoon? They write exposition. Now, exposition is not bad. It's a field of writing, and it's really important. So when you're establishing your plot outlines and saying, like, this is what's going to happen and this is why it's going to happen, being able to write good exposition is important because it clearly establishes a chain of events and the conflicts and what it is we're going to do. In fact, I'd say that the exposition behind the Amazing Digital Circus is pretty solid. A character winds up in a mystical world they don't really understand. Perhaps they were hit by a truck, it's your standard isekai thing. They don't remember their past, they don't know why they're here, there are other people who are trapped here, and so you got this fish out of water thing, you're like, oh, what's going on? The other characters explain everything to Pomni because the audience also needs to know what's going on. But also there's a twist. At some point, for some reason, people abstract, which is when they turn into like giant monsters due to emotional stress or something. It's not entirely clear. It'll be revealed as the show goes on. And so there we go. Through exposition, we have kind of a reasonable sounding show premise. Like, it works. It's actually a formula that has been applied before. It's fine. It's solid. Then if you explain the characters in an expository style, they're also good characters. Like, let's take Kinger. He's probably the computer scientist who built the circus, but he's gone mad because of his time there in the circus. He was there with his wife, but she abstracted, and that was very traumatic for him. The fact that he's been there for so long, even though he probably was the one who programmed the circus and best knows about it, implies there is no way out. Ooh, that's very good. If you're doing like an infotainment channel where you explain characters to people. When it comes time to actually do the show, though, you ideally don't want to just be telling the audience facts about your characters. You want them to be experiencing the characters and to get a sense of who the characters are. And that's where the Amazing Digital Circus begins to fall apart. They can write exposition, but it's clear that they don't really know how to write characters. So a good character, you could pick them up and put them into just about any situation and you would know exactly how they would behave. Like, let's look over at something like really basic. Let's look over at Inside Out, which was a movie about feelings. So you have the character joy and the character depression, character anger, fear, jealousy, or whatever. Disgust, that's what it was. So you put those characters in any given situation and they are going to behave like joy or like depression. This is a great example for character writing because they're acting out like an emotion really clearly, and it defines everything about the character. Now, not only that, but these are basic emotions they're representing, yet they still have range. So depression is not just sad all the time, she has like a range of feelings but is centered on depression. Whereas joy also can kind of experience sadness or feel setback or things like that, but mainly she's like this optimist. So let's imagine that we take Anger from Inside Out, and then we trap him under a stage with Pomni in the Amazing Digital Circus. How does Anger react to finding out that he's a fictional entity? He gets angry, right? He gets stubborn, he pushes back, he fights with her, he's like, no, you're fake. And you don't even have to think about it. I mean, it's in his name, obviously. He's Anger, he gets angry. But you know how he's gonna act. So you can have characters that aren't quite as archetypical, who you wouldn't maybe say like, this character is Anger. But you still would expect to know how they're going to behave if you drop them into any situation. So the thing is though, is that you cannot get there through exposition. So if you imagine dropping the character Anger from Inside Out into the Amazing Digital Circus, Anger would not stand there and tell Pomni, like, I'm having feelings of anger. You know, it's like that Futurama quote, you can't just have characters announce how they feel, that makes me feel angry. You have to define characters by how they behave, by how they act. They've got to act out who they are. So Anger doesn't sit there and have like a big emotional payoff moment where he's like, oh, I'm angry. He'll act angry. He'll yell at Pomni. He'll fight with Pomni. He'll refuse to listen to Pomni. He'll behave like an angry person. And at the end of all that, if they do agree to work together, if they reconcile, he's going to do it on his terms. Like, it's going to be stubborn, but he'll stubbornly accept Pomni's point of view or whatever. Then, of course, if you take Joy, you know, she's like an optimist, so she'd be like, come on, Pomni, let's go, and whatever. In the second Inside Out film, in fact, they have this interaction between Joy and Anger, where Joy starts to give up, and then Anger is too stubborn to quit, and they play off each other that way. So Inside Out is a very character-driven script, with very clear characters, whereas The Amazing Digital Circus is an extremely exposition-driven show, with really weak characters. I mean, one way you can tell this is describe Pomni's personality when she's not having a panic attack. In fact, I posed this question to somebody, and then the answer they gave me, like, they were like, I guess kind of like withdrawn? And I would say that's probably about as accurate as you're gonna get. Pomni is very withdrawn, like she's not very expressive, she doesn't really have much personality. And some people say, like, well, that's fine because I'm self-inserting and we don't want her to have too much personality, or otherwise maybe I can't self-insert into her. And that actually does work for, like, for example, the Hunger Games. Katniss had no personality. And that's because her entire story was about being presented with, like, really obvious moral choices. Would you kill an 11-year-old? And the audience is supposed to go, no, and then feel like a good person because everyone else in the book is killing 11-year-olds. Digital Circus is not about that. It's not about presenting these moral choices which the audience is supposed to side with. It's supposed to be character-driven, like following Gooseworks and what she's been saying. She's like, it's a character-driven plot with really weak characters. And even if we accept that Pomni is supposed to be this kind of blank slate audience surrogate type, like you might see in a harem anime or something, well, okay, describe the personalities of Gangle. Like, describe the personality of Kinger. Describe Jax's personality, honestly. Like, people are kind of aware he's supposed to be a bit, maybe like a griefer, or he's supposed to be mean, but he's kind of not consistent about it. Like, I'm not really clear on who Jax is personally. In fact, if I had to summarize him, I would say he seems like someone who thinks he's smarter than everybody, but is absolutely not. Now, I will say there are clear characterizations in the show. So, like, Ragatha is obviously very motherly. So, like, you could drop Ragatha into virtually any other show, and I think I've got a pretty clear idea of how Ragatha would behave. So, Ragatha's a good character. Kane is also a good character. He's very bombastic, he's like a showman. I get him. You could drop him into any other scenario, I understand how he would behave. I really kind of hate Zubul, but I understand what Zubul is. Like, Zubul is like a stick in the mud. Zubul is unhappy. Like, I understand how Zubul would behave in any given situation. She doesn't have main character energy. Like, as someone who just refuses to be part of everything and everybody just, like, lets her separate herself from the main plot. That's not great, but, like, she's clearly who she is. She makes a solid side character. Or if anyone was like, Zubul, you have to come with us, and then her suffering was like the joke, that would be good, but they're really not using Zubul very well. The pilot episode kind of implies that that's going to be what Zubul is, like she gets dragged into the adventure unwillingly and then she's mad about it, but it's not really expressed all that well. And then later on, they just do this therapy couch thing where Zubul sits on the couch and exposits her feelings. They just keep going back to exposition. So anyway, though, here's the thing. The reason why we don't want to learn from this, why we don't want to copy this, is because, like I mentioned before, a lot of independent animators will do what Digital Circus is doing. That is, they write exposition, and then instead of doing character writing, they just do expository writing. A good example of this would be Monkey Wrench, which sadly ran out of funding 3 episodes in. If you tried to pitch Monkey Wrench with, like, an exposition, it would make sense. Like, oh, we're gonna have this buddy duo in space, they're bounty hunters, and they get into all kinds of wacky adventures. Like, it sounds like a feasible show. But then when it came time to execute, it was like, well, what is Shrike's personality and Beeb's personality? These are the main characters of this show. And Shrike's main thing was that he was kind of annoying. And then Beeb's was fat? I guess. Like, that was his whole personality. He's just a fat guy that talked to Shrike. So for 3 episodes, we would introduce these 2 characters to, like, conflict, but then you couldn't really say how would these characters act in these situations because their characterizations were very unclear. So let's go back to Inside Out, though. Let's suppose that we decide we're going to do a duo comedy featuring 2 characters from Inside Out, only they're in space and they're bounty hunters. So let's suppose that one of them is anger, and then we could have the other one be depression, or we could have him be fear, or even disgust. Like, the duo, you would know how they would behave. You would know where they would clash, like what they would fight over, and you know how they would react to all these weird intergalactic situations, because the characters, anger and depression, are very, very clear. For example, depression might wear a little bit thin if you weren't careful, but you could imagine, suppose anger put depression in charge of the finances because taxes make anger too angry. But Depression always thinks like, oh, we're running out of money, we're losing. So she takes like the worst jobs because she doesn't even believe in the team's ability to get anything done. And then they wind up in these awful situations, and Anger, through sheer stubbornness and tenacity, manages to pull them out of it. With like the dead weight of depression the whole time. It could work. Like, it could be, at the very least, the stakes would be higher and the whole thing would be a lot more interesting than what Monkey Wrench wound up being. Since it is a duo comedy, you probably would be better off with Anger and Fear, because they're both more driven emotions and they would conflict a lot more, which is, conflict is good for story. But regardless though, if you had clear characters, then people would be more invested. And instead of just farting around and then having a fight scene at the end, there would be all this, like, emotional stuff that's happening just through the dialogue and how the characters interact. So with the Modest Digital Circus episode 2, that was kind of what I was driving at by just having the scene under the stage where Pomni and Gummy Goo are talking. I thought, like, well, what if these characters just had a natural-sounding conversation? And I didn't make them, like, strong characters. I didn't give them, like, really strong emotional cores. I just had them talk naturally. And the point was to sort of illustrate, like, well, what if we didn't cut away from Gummy Goo grappling with his non-existence? What if we just stuck to the characters for that whole interaction? At the end of it, do we kind of know them better? And I think we do. In fact, I think that it says a lot that they cut away from Gummy Goo right at that pivotal moment when he's about to discover that he's fake. We get to that scene, and I think that they just didn't know how anyone would behave in the given situation. So Gummy Goo, he turns to Pomni, and he says, "Tell me what I am." And that on its face is a really weird thing for somebody to say, because people tend not to internalize problems. Like, if you found yourself in a room with clones of yourself, you wouldn't say, like, oh no, I must be fake. You would say, oh gosh, the situation is something. Like, I have feelings about this situation, and the feelings you'd have would depend on you and the type of person you are. But very, very few people would immediately assume, like, oh no, I'm not real. I think the reason why Gummy Goo in that scene immediately concludes that he's not real is that it makes it easier to transition into him accepting that he's not real, because they have this, like, silent, he's like working things out in his head, and then the audience is supposed to assume that Gummy Goo mentally arrives at the same knowledge the audience has, which is that Gummy Goo is an NPC. And then, instead of working through that, they just cut to the B-plot with the Goo rapist, or whatever he was. Then when they cut back, a cut implies an indeterminate amount of time has passed, so we don't know what Pomni has said, or what Gummy Goo has gone through, or anything. We just know that Gummy Goo is accepted, he doesn't exist, and he's sad about it. And then you get this big emotional payoff, where Pomni sits next to him, and she's like, oh, we have something in common. I guess we could both kind of learn from each other. What did we learn? I don't know. And then, of course, the fans, they say, well, it's fine, we didn't need characterization from Gummy Goo, because the whole point is to better develop Pomni. But Gummy Goo coming to terms with his non-existence was the conflict, and we cut away from it. The payoff, where Gummy Goo accepts Pomni as an ally, and is like, yeah, we have something, that's the end. That's the end of that story. We cut the story portion. We cut the conflict and everything that you would use to build Pomni up and show who her character is and how she's developing, so that we could get to the big emotional payoff at the end. And I think basically they did that because they don't know who Pomni is, and they don't know how she would behave if they put her in a genuinely emotional situation that wasn't scripted. And of course they do the same thing with Kinger. They just, like, trap them in a room together, and then Kinger sits there and he exposits his past and tells you, like, oh yeah, if you turn the lights off, I become sane, and my wife and my trauma. And although he explains, like, his character Hook and everything to you, we really don't learn much about who Pomni is or who Kinger is, even though we spend a 20-minute episode on Kinger and Pomni together. We learned what Kinger is, and that's going to be what you'll see fans defending. They'll say, oh, we know what Kinger is all about. It's very clear. Did you not watch the episode? I saw what he is about. He said what he does. And, this is... But if you picked Kinger up and you dropped him into a harem anime, like you're like, here, Kinger, you're the main character of Tenchi Muyo, how would he behave? How would he react? I have no idea, personally. I can tell you, though, how the girls would react in Tenchi Muyo, because they're pretty well characterized for the most part. I mean, for one thing, Warshu would isolate a tachyon and cure Kinger of his insanity. I mean, it shouldn't be hard, she just has to turn the lights off for starters. And then beyond that, she'll work from there. Afterward, I'm gonna be honest, Tenchi himself has no personality, so if you replace Tenchi with Kinger, I don't think the show would change very much. But anyway, though, I don't just bring up Monkey Wrench out of the blue to dump on them. It's important because if you look at Monkey Wrench, you see they got about 3 episodes before they ran out of funding, and that was it. I mean, like, they couldn't go on. And where are we at with The Amazing Digital Circus? We're 3 episodes in, and people are going to be saying things like, oh, well, Jax hasn't been characterized yet, or Gangle hasn't been characterized yet, because we're only 3 episodes in. But if we're talking about indie projects, I mean, like, you may not have a 4th episode. Like, you may run out of funding. So for us to be 3 episodes in, when we have 20 to 25 minutes per episode, and we still kind of don't really know who Pomni, our main character, is as a personality, that is actually a failure of writing. Like, it's not good that we don't have a clear picture of Jax. It's not good that we really don't know who Gangle is. It's not great that we really kind of only know what Kinger's about, but not who he is. The show is surprisingly irresponsible with time. Like, for example, in the 2nd episode, it takes them almost 5 minutes just to start the truck chase. And then it takes them 10 minutes for them to actually get underneath the stage and have Pomni start interacting with Gummy Goo. Like, an episode of Bluey can have a child come to terms with the concept of death in 11 minutes. If it takes that same amount of time just to sort of get to the central plot point of an episode, that is wasteful. They could have cut practically the first 5 minutes of episode 2. They could have actually started with the truck chase and had just a small amount of dialogue establishing why they were there. So when it comes to that question of, like, what can we learn from the Amazing Digital Circus if we want to make our own independent projects, which are not really independent because we're all locked down by a single powerful company? The answer is not to copy their writing. Digital Circus's writing is not very good. I would say more likely their key to success is the lore bait, the bright colors, the appeal to small kids. I mean, this is YouTube, and we know that they're preying on kids. So probably that's a big component. In fact, I am sure that the 9 and under audience is such a big component of this because we haven't really seen what I would think of as a traditional fandom for The Amazing Digital Circus. It's got hundreds of millions of views, and I do see fan art, and I do know that people enjoy the show and everything like that, but we're not seeing lots of, like, fan art that depicts the characters in scenes, because it's kind of unclear who the characters are or how they would behave in certain scenes, so there's not as much inspiration there. I'm not seeing as many comics or as many, like, insider jokes. Now, this could all be, like, it might just be social media. Maybe I'm not in the bubbles that are really celebrating the Amazing Digital Circus, so I'm not seeing all this content. Or it could be that a lot of the viewers are small kids and they're just consuming the episodes and then they go and they talk about it with their friends, but because they're little kids, they're not, like, making lots of art or writing lots of fan fiction or anything. Like, I don't know, I mean, like, with a lot of other fandoms, I see them. You know, you saw Gem Sonas from Steven Universe, and of course My Little Pony was very big. You saw lots of art from that. Deltarune and Undertale, you would see tons of artwork and comics and stories about the characters, fan projects, but I see not a lot for Digital Circus. To me, that implies there might not be a totally organic audience, or that this is a question of, like, what works on YouTube and not necessarily, like, what makes a really good show. But anyway, though, there will be people who still disagree, and it's whatever. I'm not mad about it. I'm not, like, necessarily trying to change minds. The reason I make this is for people who are interested in my perspective on writing and are curious, like, what I'm really thinking. I take the analytical approach because I do a lot of writing and I think about writing when I watch a show. When I joke, like, you've got to turn your brain off to enjoy the amazing digital circus, that's kind of where it comes from, is like, yeah, I enjoy it while I watch it, but only when I'm not thinking about it. When I think about their writing and I think about the stuff they're doing, it starts to kind of, it gets up my, under my skin. So I enjoy it best by just not really putting a lot of thought into it. But regardless, I mean, like, I'm not gonna make an impact. There's hundreds of millions of views on them. I'm pretty sure they're safe from me, because after all, it's kind of just me and you guys here on this channel. So it's not a big deal. And that's it. That's what I think. So whether or not you agree, I mean, for those who are interested at least in the idea, in the kind of the thought of writing and characters and stuff like that, I hope that you found this interesting, at least to think about. The creative career is tough. It's so subjective, and there are so many different ways you can get to a good product. Typically, audiences don't know that something is bad unless it's obviously bad. Like, everyone can point out a problem. Like, if you imagine watching a stage show, and you got Peter Pan, and they're trying to pull Peter Pan up on a rope, and the rope snaps, then you as an audience member can be like, oh yeah, that's a problem right there, the rope snapping and the actor died, amateur mistake, like, you can see the flaws. But if it comes to, like, well, how would you actually design a rig to safely hoist an actor up into the air? That's a professional thing. And you're gonna have to talk to a professional about that. So the issue of, like, well, how do I make a good product, or, like, it's harder, and again, there's lots of different ways you could get to that answer, especially with writing and animation, art, everything else. The point is that just like with all the other creative fields, there are different fields of writing, and, exposition is not the only field there is. That's why it's good to have a team of writers who are all fairly competent, because one of them might be good at one thing and another's going to be good at something else, and you can bounce ideas off of each other and work to make a better product. But, you don't always, as an indie project, you don't always get the luxury of working with multiple people, so. Or, even worse, sometimes you're working with someone who can animate, but they can't write, and they fight with you because they're the director or whatever. I'm not implicating anyone specifically. In fact, I want to say one reason why Rainbow Dash Presents was so good was because working with Pederep, Pederep always had his own grasp of story. Like, visual storytelling was something he's phenomenal at. So between he and I, it was a very harmonious team, and that was how we got something so good. So some of you guys are just like, everything else isn't so good. Well, it's because I had Pederep with me on Rainbow Dash Presents. So, yeah, that's a good example of there. But anyway, though, I'm just rambling at this point, so we'll call it here. I hope you guys have a fantastic week, month, whatever.